Okay everyone, welcome to an already existing segment I started on here that I like to call Legends of the Black Cat, where I take you deep into my secret past. So without further ado, here we go. At some point in their lives, whenever one reaches adulthood, one does have a tendency to be a little nostalgic for their childhoods. They tend to reminisce about all the good times they've had, of all the things they did as kids, of all the toys they had, movies they saw, and so on. Well, today I'm going to be that person as I'm feeling a little bit nostalgic. Today we're going to talk about my childhood growing up in the 80s and 90s in Red Hook, New York. Specifically some things I did and some things that were around when I was growing up. And even though it hasn't really shaped who I am today, it still makes for a really good video. As I grew up during the 80s, which as I also mentioned was the best time for movies, TV shows, and music. At that time there was also no internet. No Facebook, no Twitter, no iPhones, smartphones. Computers were not as everywhere as they are now, and even if they were way too expensive back then. Camcorders were a lot heavier and were VHS based instead of digital and more compact like they are now. There were no reality shows polluting the airwaves, and video game systems were actually on the rise and not as sophisticated as your garden variety PlayStation 3s, PlayStation 4s, Xbox 360s and Xbox Ones, and Wii's, which meant that you still had to go to the arcade to play video games. So due to the lack of technological advances that we have now, meaning your iPhones and your internets, kids normally played outside, and there was a lot of outdoor activities to do and places to go. Growing up in Red Hook, the one place where people went during the summer and still do is the Dutchess County Fair in Rhinebeck. It was a real staple of my childhood, and I went there every year until I moved up to central New York in 2002. It is one of the few things I miss about living downstate. Hopefully someday I'll be able to go back, although it might be a little more expensive now than it was when I was last down there. The last county fair I went to was back in 2005, the Herkimer County Fair, and it doesn't even hold a candle to the Dutchess County Fair. In fact, when I went to the Herkimer County Fair, there was like nothing there. I was bored out of my mind. I haven't been to a county fair since. Another place I went to as a kid was the Catskill Game Farm. I'm sure a lot of people downstate remember that. I remember going there on field trips and sometimes with my family. I've been living in central New York for several years when the game farm closed up in 2006. However, during its heyday, it was fun to see all the exotic animals without having to go to a faraway zoo like the Bronx Zoo, which I also went to when I was a kid. I haven't been to the Utica Zoo yet, but it's on my to-do list. Then there was the old Rhinebeck Airdrome, which was a nod to airplanes that fought in World War I. They had shows every weekend during the summer where people flew replicas of planes to reenact World War I aerial battles. I even got to participate in one of the shows one time when I got to shoot down the Black Baron, which was a nod to the Red Baron. And I'm not talking about Snoopy here. I'm talking about the real deal. I wouldn't mind seeing a movie about him someday, the Red Baron. Let's see, where else did I go as a kid? Well, I also went to the Jersey Shore a couple times as a kid. This was long before it was associated with Snooki, The Situation, and Pauly D. In fact, I didn't even go to Seaside Heights. I actually went to Wildwood and Cape May for the summer. Went swimming in the ocean, went out on the boardwalk. I also went up to the Thousand Islands a couple times as well. It was also during my childhood that I traveled as far west as Missouri for a rabbit show. Yeah, we raised rabbits when I was a kid. For class trips in school one summer, we went camping for the weekend, as well as going on a class trip to the Museum of Natural History in New York City in 5th grade. And one fond memory I had while being on the bus is having a whole bus full of 5th graders ogling the hot city chicks on their way to work. Then when we got into junior high, specifically in 8th grade, we went on a class trip to Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1993. We didn't go into the White House or anything. This was during the Clinton era. But among some of the things we did was we went to Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln was shot, and we saw the house where he died. I specifically remember the tour guide at Ford's Theater when we got to the house. I remember him saying, "The bed! The pillow!" where he was pointing out the bed where Lincoln died, and the pillow that still had his bloodstains on it. Then, as we were leaving, he was saying, "Remember, New York is #1. To which I replied sarcastically, "Yeah, and don't you forget it." We also went to the Smithsonian, Union Station, Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's home, and a variety of other places as well. All in all, those were fun trips that I went on, well, at least until Puerto Rico in high school, but that's for another video. I discovered my creative side very early on, like when I first started going to school. That was when I first started getting into writing. Back then, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be a writer or an actor. If people could only see me now, especially when I'm doing both on the internet right now. In 5th grade, I had done a series of film strips where I did public presentations to my classes. And look at me now, doing videos that are seen all over the web and all over the world. Yeah, my creative imagination is still in top form. Now let's move on to some other childhood memories, like what I grew up with, like favorite TV shows, movies, toys I played with, and other stuff that I remember. Of course, some of these are items that kids today probably will never grow up with. Let's start with TV shows. I watched cartoons all the time, just like everybody else. We had Saturday morning cartoons, and we even had cartoons after school. Good times. It was always a fun time in a kid's life back then. Well, now the only cartoons we see on Saturday mornings are crappy educational cartoons on NBC, or anime stuff on the CW. Like everyone else, I watched shows like He-Man, Transformers, Garfield, Ghostbusters, Ninja Turtles, and basically any cartoon on Nickelodeon that was on during the 80s. And I also watched She-Ra, and that got me lusting after girls. I'm sure at some point in people's life they find themselves fantasizing about a female cartoon character. After all, it's nothing to be ashamed of. I always got turned on whenever she transformed into She-Ra. Even though some people would still say April O'Neil is the hottest cartoon character, and I would agree she is. Others would say Jessica Rabbit from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but I just put She-Ra a lot higher. But I didn't limit my TV watching to cartoons. I watched some TV shows in the primetime hour as well, and back then, TV shows weren't as gratuitous with the sex and violence as they are now. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing. But there weren't any reality shows polluting the airwaves like they are now. Anyway, as far as grown-up shows go, I watch shows like The Dukes of Hazzard, Knight Rider, Alf, the 60s Batman TV series, Star Trek, both the original and the Next Generation, The A-Team, the original Battlestar Galactica, the cheesy one where Starbuck was a man and not a hot chick, and so many more to name that I would be here all day mentioning, and I don't really want to do that. Okay, now before I continue with this video, I'm going to do a little show and tell right now. Because right before I got the idea for this story, I dug around a bit and I came up with some of my old toys that I still have. So I figure I'm going to do a little show and tell. So anyway, I got some He-Man figures. A little Batman figurine from when I went down to Wildwood as part of the Bat marketing campaign surrounding the release of the 1989 Tim Burton Batman movie. Got a Ghostbuster from the cartoon series that came out. Batman figure, although I got that a little later on. Got Stripe, the figurine. He's the main villain from Gremlins, the original. And I have a whole slew of toys. Now I just want to clarify one thing. Just because I have these toys around doesn't make me a man-child or anything. It's just that a lot of times when you grow up and you decide to have a family, you want something passed down to your kids, and I find that very important. I am to this day a huge fan of 80s music, and when I was growing up downstate, 80s music was king. The radio stations downstate that I listened to at the time were WBPM 94.3 in Kingston, It has long since abandoned its original top 40 format, NWSBK, K104 in Poughkeepsie, which still plays top 40 hits. Some of my favorites from that era were Madonna, Whitney Houston, Bon Jovi, Michael Jackson, Mariah Carey, and so many others I can't really think of them right off the bat. In later years, I found a new appreciation for 80s music, and I prefer that to a lot of the music, such as the Justin Bieber bullshit that they play right now. As far as movies go, I've seen quite a bit of the biggest movies to come out of the 80s. I saw my first movie when I was 2 years old, and that was in the summer of 1980. And also, like I've said in previous videos, that movie was The Empire Strikes Back. Usually the theater of choice for me when I was growing up was the Lyceum Cinema in Red Hook. When I first saw E.T. the Extraterrestrial there in 1982, it was a one-movie theater. It got an extension in the mid-80s, so that way they can show 2 movies there. I also went to the Hudson Valley Mall. At the time it was a 6-movie theater, but has since evolved into a multiplex. Even though it was a bit expensive, and there were also drive-ins where you could go during the summer. For example, there was the Sunset Drive-In in Hudson, where I saw Empire Strikes Back. And I also went to see several other movies there, including Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, the original Back to the Future before it closed down in the late 80s. The other drive-in I went to was the Hyde Park Drive-In, and the first movie I saw there was Return of the Jedi, and a few weeks after that I saw Superman 3 there. And then as well as the original Gremlins movie. And the last time I was there was back in 1998, sometime after I graduated from high school, and I saw the asteroid film Deep Impact. And to this day, the Hyde Park Drive-In is one of the few remaining drive-in theaters in this country still in operation. But anyway, back to the Lyceum. The original theater continued to be in operation until 1991, when it became a multiplex that showed 6 movies. It now shows 8 movies and also includes 3D movies. The last movie I saw in the original theater was Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And while the main theater became an antique store, the extra theater they reopened as the Lyceum Annex sometime afterwards. But anyway, even then going to movies was fun and exciting. And during my childhood, we were starting to come into the video age. If you're as old as I am, you'll definitely remember video discs. The video discs back in the day was the prototype that would become what DVDs are in today's world. And then you flip it over to watch a movie. The video disc was basically how I first saw the original Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Then later we upgraded to videotapes and VCRs. My family never owned a video camera, even though they were popular as well, so I never got to make videos growing up. So you won't see any embarrassing videos of me growing up on the internet anytime soon. Okay, what other childhood memories are there? One memory recently came to me when I was watching a show on the web called 80s Dan, where in one episode he buried a McDLT in a time capsule. For those of you who don't know what that is, McDonald's put out a sandwich that came out in a styrofoam container with 2 sides. One side is the top of the bun, including the lettuce, tomato, and cheese, while on the other side had the burger and the bottom part of the bun. Hence the tagline, "The hot stays hot while the cool stays cool." I used to get the McDLT pretty much all the time during its heyday. McDonald's should really consider bringing that back. And I could go on forever as far as talking about my childhood, but I probably should call it a day. I'm not doing a movie here, well, not yet anyway. But if you grew up during the 80s and 90s and remember a lot of the stuff I mentioned here today, then your childhood was awesome. They say that as you get older, you start appreciating your childhood a bit more, but at the end of the day, you have to move forward. But hey, there's nothing wrong with nostalgia.